Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have an absolutely chilling collection of camping scary stories for you to enjoy. I'm also joined by my friend J Nightmares, who has contributed some stories to tonight's video. If you enjoy his work, you can follow the link down below to hear more. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm a 17-year-old guy, currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail, because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you share stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghost, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail I was taking on an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancellation on his part left me on my own. So, with a packed bag and car ready to go, I decided to go on my own, not leaving the house on time and having trouble navigating rough forest roads. I didn't arrive at the trailhead until around 5:45, which for those of you who do not backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast, so I figured if I moved quick enough, I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is especially scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that was when I figured I needed to stop and set up camp. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot. But there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was getting a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood and got the fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac I had bought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good, my camp was set up, and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike had almost gone away, but it was still there, the side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything on the edge of that circle is pitch black, and past it. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating my dinner, when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at the tiny rock in shock, as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned on my light and towards the area where I had seen the rock come from, but due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for what or whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from the fire that in hindsight offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely inaudible if you weren't listening for them, but they were still there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear, as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got, as I came to realize it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my whole life where I nearly defecated myself. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line in the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand, and kept my head on a swivel. I weighed my options, staying here and waiting out the night, or attempting the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever, or whoever was out there with me, was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light. So I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night there. Eventually it came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could hear it. It sounded like someone elderly walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk too far away, and I would lose the sound of its steps. But then, about an hour later, maybe 2, it would return, still faint as ever. This went on for about 3 to 4 hours, until I listened to the steps get closer and closer, until they were about 7 feet from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small, as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there, still, for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand, and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed-walked the 3 miles back down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked, and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and drove. I did not stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see and/or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what was written on the dust on the back of my window of my car. Sleep well? A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far, so I thought I'd share. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay away from there. In the early 1990s, a friend and I went camping in the Royal National Park just south of Sydney, Australia. The campsite we chose was truly in the middle of nowhere, and we had been there several times before, so we knew exactly where we wanted to set up. From the car park, which was nearly empty, you walked down a long bush track along the side of a mountain until you reached the bottom and came to a beach. To the right of the beach was the cabin area of the campground, with 1 or 2 people there. If you turned left instead, there was a very large grassy plain with a series of rolling green hills. The last of those hills before a second vast field had a point where the land dropped off into a cliff overlooking the ocean. The downside of the hill was covered in trees, so you had to follow the top of the hill inland until you came to a small path through the trees that led down to the second field. That field was surrounded by forest. On the far side of it was a small alcove in that wall of trees that made a perfect windbreak and was only a 10-meter walk from the beach. That was our preferred campsite, and we had used it before. By the time we reached it, it was just after 2 p.m. We set up camp, walked down to the beach, had a swim, and spent some time milling around while getting ready for the night. We had camped a bit, but we were not what you would call experienced outdoor folk. For example, if we did not have matches or a lighter, there was no fire. At some point, we realized the matches we had bought on the way to the campground were still in the center console of the car. We tossed a coin, I lost, and I began the long walk back to retrieve them. By the time I got back and made my way to the first field, it was only about an hour before sunset, so it would be dark by the time I returned to camp. I did have a heavy-duty flashlight. It was a black metal cylinder body that law enforcement often used, and was very sturdy and reliable. I say this because it doubled as a weapon if I ever needed one. I reached the last hill, found the path through the trees, and headed down towards the second field. When I cleared the trees, I found my friend standing there. I asked him what he was doing. He said he had come to help me because I was obviously having some trouble. I asked what he meant, and he said he had seen my flashlight beam sweeping around the top of the hills for the last half hour or so. I told him I had only just reached the path a few minutes earlier, and it couldn't have been me. He was looking past me, towards the top of the hill, when suddenly he asked, "Who else was up there?" "No one," I said. "So where was the light coming from?" I turned around, and sure enough, I could see a beam of light at the top of the hill, swinging back and forth. I knew no one was up there. I had just been there, and it was an open field with nowhere to hide. I shone my flashlight in that direction, and suddenly the light disappeared. Almost immediately after that, my flashlight died, and it had been working perfectly only a second earlier, but the moment I aimed it towards the hill, it stopped. That was not the strangest thing though, not by a long shot. As we stood at the edge of the trees looking up at where the light had been, we suddenly became aware of a building standing on the edge of a cliff. That could not have been there. There had never been a building there. We had been there at least 4 times before, and there had never been anything on that cliff even remotely resembling a building. Even if there had been, I would have seen it when I was up there only 5 minutes earlier. We stood there staring at it, trying to figure out what we were looking at, when I noticed a couple of silhouettes moving around it. They moved towards the building, past it, to the cliff and back again. As they reached the side of the building closest to us, both the silhouettes and the building faded away. They simply vanished. We looked at each other trying to make sense of what it was we had just seen, and it was at that moment my flashlight miraculously came back on. That did not help our nerves at all. We quickly turned around and hurried back across the field to our campsite. Once we had the fire lit and eaten, we sat around and talked about what we had seen, but neither of us could explain it. Was it a hallucination? How could we have the same hallucination? And what would we tell anyone that would not make us sound insane? We could not think of a way to tell the story, so we agreed not to tell anyone we knew. We didn't need to. We could live quite happily only discussing it between ourselves. The next day we packed up camp and headed back to the car. As we passed the spot where the building would have been, we stopped to investigate. There were no physical signs that anything had ever been there. The grass was long and undisturbed except for the path that I had made through it the previous night. We kept going, got back to the car and drove home in nearly complete silence. We mentioned the incident a few times over the years, but as time went by we both tried to forget it. It was not until my friend died that I started thinking about it again. I thought maybe the anonymity of the internet would make it easier to share. I have still never been back to that campsite. Even just sharing the story has me on edge. But it's ridiculous, right? Things like this cannot exist. Can they? My father used to enjoy going to a campground not far from the hometown where he grew up. The campground was in Cavendish, Vermont, and it was called Catton Place. He liked how peaceful and remote the area was, and after visiting it a few times and seeing that it was family-friendly, he thought it would be nice to bring his daughter with him. He usually went around the same time of year, so he kept seeing familiar faces. There was one campsite occupied by 3 men from out of state in their 40s, most likely from Boston judging by their accents. They had a big, fancy trailer, and their site was fully decked out with a dartboard, hammock, lawn chairs, garden gnomes, and patches of fake grass. From what my father could tell, they stayed there for a few weeks at a time. They were settled in and clearly very comfortable. They walked around with an air of superiority and act like they owned the place, where the campground was actually run by an elderly couple, and these macho guys were apparently friendly with them. The year before, they had painted the playground for free, so the elderly couple loved them. My father had seen the men the previous year, but he had not had to deal with them because their campsite was far from his. This time, unfortunately, our site was placed much closer to theirs, with only one empty campsite between us. We were also surrounded by other empty sites, and about 30 feet away there was a middle-aged couple camping nearby. We arrived and set up camp. I remember my father waving hello to the men across from us, and they waved back. During the day, I played on the campground. At night, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. While those men across the way partied hard, there was booze everywhere. The radio was blasting, and there was plenty of laughing and bickering too. We did not pay much attention to them and honestly mostly kept to ourselves. After a while, we grew tired and crawled into our tents to sleep, but the noise kept going. I managed to fall asleep, but my father couldn't. He lay there for a few hours and checked the time occasionally. It got closer and closer to midnight, and he started wondering whether the middle-aged couple nearby were having trouble sleeping too. It was at that moment that he heard a vehicle coming down the road. It was the elderly man who owned the campsite. He stopped and told the men there had been a noise complaint. They apologized profusely and said they would be settling in soon. After he left, they immediately started cussing and throwing things around their campground. They were offended that someone had reported them. It was then that I could hear them complaining and conspiring. I could hear them mentioning that there was a guy with a little girl next to us and a couple over there. One of them added that they didn't see anyone leave in their car to the front desk, and that one of the people must have a cell phone. Bear in mind, this happened in the year 1997, so cell phones were not nearly as common as they are now. The men started trying to figure out who had a phone, and they weren't bothering to keep their voices down. My father could hear every word. Then they came to the conclusion that it must be the guy with the Cadillac. They were talking about my father, but he didn't have a cell phone. That was when the fear hit him hard. He had no idea what they were going to do, and he needed to think fast. Then he heard stumbling footsteps coming right up to the tent only inches away. He had nothing but a soda can and a flashlight to protect us. He grabbed the soda can and flicked the top with his finger to make a noise. The guy was startled and stepped back, then hurried off to rejoin his drunk buddies. They whispered among themselves after that, but my father couldn't make out most of it. He caught the part where they said they were going to try again later, which made him wonder if he had heard them correctly. What on earth were these guys trying to do? By then there was no way my father was going to sleep. He wasn't tired anymore. He was running on pure adrenaline. He was there with his daughter feeling helpless, and all he had was a soda can and a flashlight. He lay frozen, listening and hoping they would give up and pass out from drunkenness. A little later the footsteps came again. Their campfire was so bright that it cast a shadow into our tent, and he could see the shape of a man coming towards us. This time the man did not come quite as close, because he stopped again when he heard movement from inside the tent. My father had unzipped his sleeping bag in a panic, ready to defend us if the men tried to come inside. But the man stopped and simply stood there watching. My father remembered that he had a lighter in his pocket. He took it out and flicked it underneath the blanket, hoping the sound would mimic a gun being readied. I don't think it worked, but the man eventually turned around and went back to his campsite. It was 2:30 in the morning, and my dad could hear them remarking how they couldn't believe that he was still awake. And my father hoped maybe they would finally go to sleep, but they didn't. I was asleep at this point, but I was tossing and turning a lot. My feet slapped against the side of the tent a few times, and a footstep came towards us while I brushed my feet against the side of the tent. And I heard an "Ugh," as the man said with an exasperated sigh. He began walking away, but not towards his campsite. He headed towards the road, walked a few feet, stopped, and then screamed at the top of his lungs that if he found out who reported us, he will kill us. Everything went quiet after that. The only sounds was the crackling of their campfire and the occasional chatter between the men. Then, at around 5 a.m., came the sound of their trailer door shutting. They were asleep. My father lay there trying to process everything that had happened, and by 6 a.m. he woke me up so we could pack up and get out of there. I remember him rushing me, and I was completely confused. Then he told me he was never going camping again. This statement is true. He never has been camping since. I still have so many questions. What did they want? Why did they need us to be asleep before they sneaked up on us? And why did they want to hurt my father or me? Did they want to steal the cell phone he never had? Or perhaps bludgeon him to death for trespassing on their fun, even though it was never him? It's terrifying to think about, and yes, my father should have spoken to the owners and made a police report. I'm not sure whether that crossed his mind at the time though. I think in that sleepless state he just wanted to get the hell out of there as quickly as he could and go home.
This happened about 10 years ago. It was during the height of summer, and 6 of us had driven out to a secluded campsite deep in the mountains. I'd been camping plenty of times before, so I was comfortable with the wilderness, confident in my ability to handle the outdoors. We pitched 2 tents next to each other, 3 friends in each tent. After building a decent fire, we stayed up drinking beer, laughing and chatting until well past midnight. The atmosphere was carefree and cheerful, and honestly, the thought of anything strange or sinister happening didn't cross any of our minds. Eventually, at around 1:30 a.m., we retreated into our tents. Inside, my 2 friends quickly fell asleep. Before long, the quiet of the mountain night was broken only by their gentle snores. I couldn't fall asleep straight away though. The snoring from my friends was just loud enough to keep me awake. Restless and a bit frustrated, I lay there staring up at the tent ceiling, waiting for sleep to finally claim me. And that's when I first noticed the sound. At first it was faint, so subtle that I nearly dismissed it. A gentle rustling noise, like a plastic bag slowly being manipulated or moved around. I remember that we'd left some food wrapped in plastic bags outside near our cooking area, and I thought it was probably an animal, a raccoon or something, investigating our leftovers. But as I listened more carefully, the rustling didn't sound random. It sounded deliberate, almost cautious. The longer I listened, the less it made sense. My pulse quickened slightly, and my curiosity began to mix with a creeping sense of unease. If an animal was out there, it would have likely knocked things over by now. Instead, the sound continued, steady, persistent, and strangely careful. Unable to ignore it any longer, I quietly sat up and edged towards the tent's entrance. My heart was pounding softly, though I wasn't sure why. Something about the situation felt inexplicably wrong. My rational mind insisted it was nothing, just my imagination running wild at night, but a deeper, instinctive part of me knew better. Slowly and carefully, I reached for the zipper of the tent flap, trying to make as little noise as possible. The metallic sound of the zipper felt shockingly loud in the silent night, and I paused several times, listening carefully to see if anything outside reacted. Finally, I peeled back the fabric just enough to peek out into the dark clearing where we'd set up camp. And what I saw sent chills racing down my spine. Standing there, illuminated by a strange dimness despite the complete darkness surrounding our campsite, were about 10 children. They stood there clustered together, perfectly still, not moving, not speaking, simply standing and staring towards our tents. Their presence was utterly impossible. We were miles away from any town or village, deep in a mountainous region where no children could have possibly wandered at this hour. Their clothes looked oddly outdated, as if they belonged to another era. Their faces were expressionless, blank, but their eyes reflected faint glimmers from the dying embers of our fire. The moment I registered their presence, a wave of dread and revulsion washed over me. Every primal instinct screamed that I was seeing something forbidden, something I absolutely should not witness. My breath caught sharply in my throat, my body seized by an overwhelming fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Quickly, I pulled away from the opening, quietly zipping the tent flap closed again. I sat there frozen, hardly daring to breathe, straining my ears to listen to whatever might happen next. Would they come closer? Would they speak? Would they enter our camp? Minutes passed, painfully slow. The only sound was now my friend's continued snoring, oblivious to the terror unfolding just outside. After what felt like an eternity, the rustling sound outside seemed to fade away, leaving nothing but heavy, oppressive silence. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear, waiting for dawn. But when morning finally came, I cautiously unzipped the tent again. Outside, everything looked normal. The bags were exactly where we left them, untouched. There were no footprints, no sign of disturbance. It was as if the children had never been there. I hesitantly asked the others if they had seen or heard anything strange through the night, but they all dismissed my story, laughing it off as a nightmare brought on by a bit too much beer. But I know what I saw. To this day, I have no explanation, but since that night, I've never camped again without remembering those silent children, standing perfectly still in the darkness. And even now, years later, whenever I hear a rustling sound at night, no matter where I am, I feel that familiar chill creeping down my spine, reminding me of what lurks just outside the tent.
In July of 2024, I went camping with a few of my cousins on family land in the middle of Tennessee. This is a lake that we had visited growing up many times before. The land borders a quiet cove that feeds directly off the main channel of a popular lake, but it's far enough out that most people never come near it. Getting there is part of the isolation. You leave town, drive another 10 miles, then turn onto something that barely qualifies as a road. It would probably be best described as a narrow gravel drive that dead ends in a clearing. But you're not done yet, good sirs. Oh no. because from there you have to park and hike almost a mile until you reach the campsite. So if it isn't evident enough, we are literally in the middle of nowhere. The walk feels boxed in. On the left, the ground rises sharply into thick woods and an old overgrown trail that was once used for horseback riding. And on the right, the land drops off steeply. It's too steep to climb down, leading straight to the water. And every so often, through the trees, you catch glimpses of the cove and the hillside across it. That used to be logging land decades ago, but was never fully cleared and is now just untouched forest. The campsite itself is strangely perfect. Flat ground right at the water's edge, easy access to the lake, and behind you nothing but a steep, wooded hillside. We set up camp and spent the afternoon swimming, relaxing, and letting my dog explore. Everything felt fine. As the evenings started to settle in, we started a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around talking while the sun went down. It wasn't long after dark that we started to hear what sounded like rockfall behind us. At first, it was a small sound, small rocks tumbling down the hillside, and the occasional rustle of a bush. We just assumed it was an animal and carried on our conversation. But then, the sound persisted. It moved back and forth, whatever it was, circling behind us, rustling the brush, getting closer but never stepping into view. After a while, one of the guys picked up a small hatchet we'd used earlier and tapped it against a rock, hoping to scare it off. The response was immediate. The woods went dead silent. The insect sounds that you hear in the background and mostly ignore shut off instinctually. Then from the tree line behind us, we heard 3 distinct taps repeated back to us. That's when we debated leaving, but the trail out was long, narrow, and completely dark. We decided staying put was safer than trying to hike out blind. We retreated into our tent, a large 12-person tent that easily fit the 5 of us and my dog. Once zipped inside, things felt lighter for a few minutes, like whatever tension had been building had eased. And that was when we heard the voices. It sounded like men having a low, muffled conversation just outside of the tent. My dog noticed it immediately. He was alert and focused, but completely silent, which is something I have never seen him do before. A while after, I unzipped the tent and looked out, but there was nothing there. I laid back down, trying to rationalize it. Maybe voices carried across the water from the main channel. You can say sound does weird things at night. I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to my cousin gently shaking my arm. The voices were back. Moonlight filtered through the tent just enough to reveal a dark shape outside. I silently woke another cousin, shushing him before he could speak, and pointed towards the shape. We stayed completely still, and the figure began to move, slowly circling the tent, again and again, getting close enough that we could hear something brushing against the fabric. It felt like whatever this thing was inspecting us. It stayed there until almost sunrise. The sky had started to lighten when someone finally worked up the courage to look outside, but whatever was there before had now gone. Nothing had been taken or disturbed. We tried to tell ourselves that it was probably a large cat, maybe a coyote. But the voices? Maybe they carried over water because of the sound. We'd camped there too many times without incident. We decided to stay through the day, but leave before dark. The day slipped by faster than expected, and by the time we noticed the sky shifting from blue to orange to pink, the sunset was already creeping in. We started packing up, and it felt like we were racing against whatever this thing was returning. We were just gathering the last of our things, all the tents at this point had been packed away, when a loud sound came from the woods behind us. It was a boom of some kind, followed by a human scream. At least it sounded nearly human. It was layered with something animalistic there in the background. We decided not to investigate. We hurried along with our packing, and within minutes were already making our way down the trail to leave.
I went camping with 6 friends last summer. We hired a small campsite in the mountains. It was a really great time, actually. We set off fireworks and had a barbecue. It was perfect. There's something so peaceful about sitting and watching a roaring bonfire, isn't there? By midnight, everyone was pretty much tuckered out. We decided that it might be time to hit the hay. We all settled in for the night, and I don't know if I was the first to hear it, but I'm confident that before the night was out, we all heard it. There was a low kind of moaning or groaning sound coming from somewhere deep in the woods. If I had to put an age on it, I would say middle-aged, and I would say that the owner of that voice was likely a woman. At points, I did wonder if it was an animal, but there was something so human-like to that voice it convinced me that it wasn't an animal. It was clearly human. There was a certain sadness to the quality and tonality of the voice. It was really unnerving. It was weird because we were pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't see any other campers in the area that we hired. I remember gathering firewood and thinking, whoa, we're the only ones out here. There weren't any houses or cabins nearby, and I didn't know who could be out here making this weird noise in the middle of the night. Anyways, the voice, the moaning and groaning voice, only lasted for about 10 minutes before it just sort of ended. In the morning, my friends and I spoke about what we had heard. We later ran into another group around the campsite, and we asked if they heard the creepy wailing sound, and they said that they had. Now, these guys were much older than us, and they looked like this wasn't their first camping trip. When we spoke to them, they confirmed that they were regulars to this particular campsite. We mentioned the screaming sound we had heard the night before, and they smiled at one another with a knowing glance and told us the following. From this point on, it's going to sound like an urban legend. It's up to you how much faith you put into our claims, but since you asked, I guess you want to know. This here used to be a site for kids' camps, summer camps. Ain't that way anymore, as you could tell. The reason for that was a disappearance. Happened on an all-girl school summer camping trip. They were learning about forestry and nature. Used to have an awful lot of camping trips around here. Something changed that night, though. It was as if the soil went sour or something. So the teachers were all up in arms because a student went missing. They turned desperate as the minutes crawled by. They found her, though. But this story doesn't have a positive ending. They found her all right, hanging from a tree limb. The rumor was the poor girl was relentlessly bullied, you see. If the teachers didn't notice the student was missing for a couple of hours, I doubt they would have taken any interest in any of the bullying. The teacher who found her apparently quit shortly after this. She couldn't cope with the guilt or the shock. During the search, she was the one who was the most vocal. She was the one calling out the student's name. She was the one who couldn't bear the shock of letting her student down. She took the same option her student did. She isn't here anymore, sadly. So we all come to the conclusion that the moaning and the groaning voice some people hear isn't the voice of the student, but the voice of the guilt-ridden teacher, still searching for her student, bound to earth by the guilt. We all trembled. I did wonder if it was all a ploy to make sure noisy young men with fireworks didn't return to their tranquil campsite sometime later, but that moaning sound was real, and it was so creepy. Summer. What a time that is. There's something special about that season.
My partner and I typically go on an annual camping trip. Our campground of choice is Rushing River Provincial Park in northwestern Ontario. It's located about 30 minutes east of Kenora, if you know where that is. We like to book the waterfront sites because we love to swim, float, paddleboard, and are basically always in the water. It's because of this, we are usually not within walking distance of washrooms or garbage cans, and at the end of the night we typically drive to drop off our trash and use the washroom and brush our teeth. After a full day of swimming, eating hot dogs and watching the stars, it was midnight when we decided that it was time to get ready for bed. We collected our garbage and toiletries and started driving towards the washroom. After going through our routine, we headed back to the campsite. Now, because of the way the road through camp is structured, we had to keep driving in the opposite direction of our campsite and find an open place to turn around. We eventually reached a rock face. Northwestern Ontario is filled with exposed rock faces that were blown up to make way for highways and railways. As we pulled into this spot, the car's headlights illuminated a young boy about 9 years old scaling the rock. He was wearing swimming shorts and a life jacket. Not only did it strike me as odd to see a child this late at night, but he was doing something pretty dangerous and we were the only adults around. I pointed the boy out to my partner, asking, "What the hell is that kid doing?" And my partner replied, "What kid?" He didn't see the boy. This freaked us both out and we started yelling, pulling away from the spot in a panic. When we went back to the campsite, we discussed what we saw. He saw nothing. This was insane to me, as the boy was clearly right in front of the car in brightly colored clothes. We did some research that night, and this is the article we found posted 5 years prior. The father of a 9-year-old boy who died in Rushing River Provincial Park said his son, Cree Brunau Thomas, slipped on a rock and drowned this weekend. Trevor Thomas said he was cooking supper Saturday night when his son disappeared. He called Cree to come and eat, but he could not be found. Hours later, after a search done by Ontario Provincial Police and park staff, Cree was found dead. I'm not too sure if I saw the spirit of the boy, or if I saw a real person and my partner somehow did not. He does not believe in ghosts while I do. Regardless, we both agreed that, to this day, it was one of the eeriest experiences of our lives.
This happened fairly recently, only about 6 years ago. Around the same time of year, I went camping and fishing with 2 friends, Hiroshi and Takumi. It was an actual campground in the area. We decided to set up closer to a pond we wanted to fish. Near the edge of the pond stood a small, rural shrine. And beside it was a quiet patch of ground where people sometimes pitched tents. We figured it would be more convenient to stay there, so we set up our tents at the corner of the shrine grounds, close enough to reach the pond easily in the morning. The 3 of us had brought solo tents, 1 each. We spent the evening fishing, grilling meat, and drinking a bit while talking about nothing in particular. Since we planned to wake up early the next day to fish again, we turned in pretty early. After a long day outdoors, sleep came quickly, and at some point during the night I heard someone calling, "Hey! Hey!" I opened my eyes. The voice belonged to Hiroshi. My mind was still foggy with sleep when he whispered urgently, "Quiet! Listen, do you hear that?" I held my breath. At first, all I noticed was the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, leaves moving gently in the breeze, the distant rustle of water near the pond. Then I heard it, a sharp metallic sound, like metal being struck against something hard. It carried through the forest, faint but distinct, blending strangely with the sounds of the bugs chirping in the night. I checked my phone. It was just after 3 a.m. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the shrine, deeper in the cedar forest that spread out beyond it. By then, the sound had woken Takumi as well. But when Hiroshi and I looked towards his tent, something felt wrong. Takumi wasn't inside it. We called his name quietly. No answer. At that point, we really didn't know what to think. Maybe he'd gone to the bathroom. Maybe he heard that noise too, and he'd gone to check it out. Either way, leaving him out there alone just didn't feel right. So Hiroshi and I decided to walk towards the sound. Carefully, we passed the shrine building and moved towards the forest. Once we reached the edge of the cedar grove, the sound became clearer. It echoed through the trees. We stepped onto a narrow animal trail leading up the slope behind the shrine, and neither of us spoke. We moved slowly, trying not to make a sound. The forest was thick with tall cedar trunks. Their branches blocked most of the sky, leaving the path dim and uneven. After climbing maybe 200 meters, my eyes finally adjusted to the darkness. That's when we saw Takumi. He was crouched beyond one of the cedar trees ahead of us. He had his back pressed against the trunk, almost like he was trying to disappear into it. Takumi noticed us and immediately raised a finger to his lips. Then he motioned us closer. Hiroshi and I crept forward, staying low. When we reached him, Takumi was drenched in sweat. His breathing was shallow and his eyes were fixed on something further up the trail. He pointed a shaky finger. About 30 meters ahead, in a small clearing between the cedar trees, there was a young woman stood facing a tree, and she was hammering something to it. I couldn't understand what I was looking at first. Then the shape became clear. A straw doll. She was holding what looked like a stone and using it to drive a long nail through the doll and into the trunk of the cedar tree. Each strike produced the metallic sound we'd been hearing. Between the blows, we could hear her muttering something under her breath. Even from that distance, fragments of her words drifted through the forest. They sounded like curses, words filled with bitterness and hatred. All three of us understood what we were witnessing. It was the Ushinokoku Mairi, an old Hour of the Ox curse ritual where someone goes to a shrine in the dead of night and nails a straw effigy to a tree while calling ruin down on the person they want to destroy. Technically, we knew she was just another person, but seeing someone perform something like that alone in the middle of a forest at 3 a.m, the atmosphere around her felt heavy and wrong. None of us wanted to stay there. Without saying it out loud, we all reached the same conclusion. We needed to leave, quietly. We started backing away. Back the same way we'd come, slowly, carefully. And as we began to turn, the woman stopped and then she spoke. "Who's there?" Her voice cut sharply through the forest. She turned towards us. Until then, we'd only seen her from behind, but now her face was visible. Her expression was twisted with rage. And before any of us could react, she screamed and she started running straight towards us. That was enough for us. All three of us turned and ran. We didn't stop to pack anything, not the tents, not the gear, we just ran. The campground was about 1 kilometer away, and we sprinted the entire distance. And by the time we reached it, we were gasping for breath. We explained the situation to the campground staff, and they let us stay in the manager's office until the morning. No one slept properly that night. When daylight finally arrived and people started moving around the campground, we worked up the courage to go back to the shrine. It was about 8 a.m. The place looked completely normal. The woman was gone. After what we'd experienced, none of us really felt like fishing anymore. We decided to pack everything up and go home. We loaded our gear into the car and got ready to leave. Then suddenly, Takumi shouted from the back seat, "Whoa!" Hiroshi and I turned around. Takumi was staring upward, pointing at the roof of the car with his mouth hanging open. I followed his finger, and I saw 3 metal points protruding from the ceiling lining, 3 5-inch nails. We got out of the car and looked at the roof. There were 3 straw dolls nailed neatly into a row in the metal. For a while, none of us said anything. It was broad daylight. Birds were calling somewhere nearby. I could hear campers laughing as they packed up their own gear. Everything around us felt normal. That was the thing that made it so weird, because whatever had happened in those woods a few hours ago clearly hadn't stayed there. We pulled the dolls out, but we didn't want to touch them for long. Hiroshi wrapped them in an old towel and threw them away at the campground before we left. Even then, it didn't feel like enough. On the drive home, nobody really spoke. I remember looking at my reflection in the passenger side window, thinking the same thing over and over. If that ritual was meant for somebody else, then why were there 3 dolls on our car? Maybe she wants to curse us for seeing her. Maybe we ruined whatever she was trying to do and she decided to pass it on to us instead. Or maybe the curse had already started the moment we stood there watching. I still think about it around this time every year. Nothing dramatic happened after that, not in the way horror stories usually go. None of us died, no one went missing. But even now, 6 years later, I've never been able to completely shake the feeling that something followed us out of those trees. And sometimes I wonder if the real curse isn't bad luck or death. Maybe it's just knowing there are some things in this world you're better off never seeing.
My boyfriend and I went backpacking in the mountains. I had been camping before, but only car camping, where I did not have to carry my bag for long, if at all, so this was my first time actually backpacking. After getting lost trying to find a parking lot, the map swore was there but was not, we drove around the mountain and finally found a parking lot at the top. We had planned to walk down the mountain, camp, and then hike back up the next day. About an hour in, maybe at 6 p.m, we came across a guy sitting off the side of the trail, cooking on a cheap gas stove. He asked if we knew where we were and if we could point him towards a certain place on the mountain, saying he had been parked there. He kept talking about how a friend had dropped him off and was going to pick him up at point A. Then he changed the story and said he was parked at point B. Then he said the friend who dropped him off went off to hike somewhere else, and another friend who had the map turned back at point C to wait in the car. We finally wished him luck and kept going down the trail. The trail was poorly marked and did not match the map we had found online, since we could not get an actual map because the park office was closed due to asbestos. We were already confused when we came to a horse trail with no markings telling us whether we were still on the right path. We decided to keep going and see if we could find a place to camp for the night, then figure out how to get out in the morning. Both sides of the trail were lined with barbed wire, so we couldn't camp there. Eventually, we ran into a huge puddle in the middle of the trail. We decided to turn back and go to the part of the trail before it became a horse trail so we could camp there for the night, because it was getting really dark and we were exhausted. About 20 feet behind us was the man from earlier. He talked to us again, and through the conversation we learned he had heavy narcotics with him, including fentanyl and other drugs. By then there were so many red flags, the changing story, following us, fentanyl, all of it. We took off and decided to go back to the car and just drive home. We lived 4 hours away and were about 6 miles from the car, so we headed back up the trail as fast as we could. I got severely dehydrated on the way and was struggling hard. We had plenty of water, but it was very hot, and we were basically running up the mountain. At some point I started hallucinating, thinking I was vomiting blood because of the red Gatorade, or that there was blood coming from my shoes because of the sweat. We ended up hiking the full 6 miles up the mountain in 2 hours. When we reached the parking lot, I gave up. I decided to wait on the bench while my boyfriend got the car. The parking lot was curved, so we couldn't see each other. He finally came back down with the car and helped me in. We found a gas station and slept there for a little while before heading home. Oh, and as we were driving out of the park, we saw a sign saying hitchhikers might be escaped convicts. So who knows what this guy's story really was.
I work for a wildlife magazine. My job is to take photos of animals in their natural habitat. A normal working day for me would be setting up my tent on a mountain trail and waiting for animals to come along. I also use an infrared sensor hooked up to an automatic shutter. I never used popular trails as animals would be too scared to come out if lots of people were around. I've never been frightened on the job, although I'm always working alone and in the dark. I've never had any troubles though, until now. I arrived at about 1 o'clock to the area I had previously researched online. It was by the bank of a swamp. The usual routine is set up the one-man tent and take a nap until about 5 p.m. or something. Because I'm always camping deep in the mountains, there's never anyone around. It feels safer than the city in many ways. That afternoon, I hung my radio from a tree branch and got into my tent, ready to go for a nap. And when I woke up later, it was already dark. I hung my lantern from the tree branch and started setting my camera equipment up. I put my headlamp on and prepared to shoot some photos. I remember being unusually tense and full of anticipation. I headed out of the tent, and that's when I noticed something strange. Upstream from the swamp about 10 meters away, I noticed a tent. It was a blue tent. It was weird. This wasn't a fishing area. This was a totally uninhabited area. I didn't think it was a mountain climber. I couldn't imagine anyone else being here but me. I could see no light coming from that tent. Maybe someone was asleep in there. Nevertheless, that tent wasn't there when I was setting mine up. Did someone come along silently whilst I was sleeping? That's also kind of weird. Anyway, I pushed on and started looking for a good place to take some photos. At that moment, a light went on in the blue tent, which made the tent color change. It went a darker color. Maybe I should go and say a courteous hello, I thought. I decided against that idea as the tent freaked me out a bit. That's really an excuse though. I didn't want to go anywhere near it. I was scared of it, and whoever might be inside it. I wanted to move to another spot. It would be a pain, but I didn't think I would be able to concentrate with that tent on my mind. So I set about dismantling my tent as quietly as possible, whilst trying to remain out of sight of the blue tent. I gathered up my stuff and began trekking deeper into the mountainous woods. I must have walked over 1 kilometer alongside the river up the mountain. I set up camp at the top of a steep hill, and by the time I put my tent up again, it was unfortunately too late to do any photography. It was past 9 o'clock. I decided to have some dinner, and after eating, I just thought it would be best if I got some sleep, because there really wasn't much else I could do. It should have been chilly since it was the middle of May, but I woke up in the middle of the night, sweating in my sleeping bag. A quick glance at my watch told me it was after 2 a.m. The air in the tent was warm and stale, so I pulled the zipper down to get some fresh, cool night air in, and I gasped. The blue tent was right in front of my tent. The strange lights came on in the tent again, and 2 hands pressed against the dirty fabric of the blue tent. The person in the tent was reaching towards me in the darkness, and for a moment, I felt so distant and so stunned, but I quickly came to my senses and grabbed my torch and pointed it at the blue tent. Whatever was in that tent was groping around to grab the zip and get out. It must have heard me and saw my torchlight. I ran for it. I didn't dare look behind me. I fell in the swamp as I ran, and my lower body was soaking, but that didn't stop me. It was pitch black as I ran. I tripped and stumbled countless times, but I was determined to get away from that tent. I lost my torch along the way. When I physically couldn't run anymore, I crouched by a tree and shivered in fear and waited until the morning light. The next day, I walked back to the place where my tent was, and that other tent. I called out to let my presence be known. I was done being scared at that point. I shouted out again, but there was no response, so I approached. Both tents were still there, but the blue tent looked a bit more worn and haggard than I remembered. I looked inside my tent, and it seems as if the person or the people in the blue tent had left me a parting gift. A pile of bones. Human bones, animal bones, I have no idea. They were all smashed up beyond recognition. Now, I don't do solo trips into the mountains or the woods anymore.
I live in northern British Columbia, Canada, and a couple of years ago my friend invited me to go with him, his mum, and his sister to a resort by a lake about an hour and a half from town. This was at the end of June and beginning of July. Now, when I say resort, it was basically just a main log building where you check in and eat, and a few log cabins, and some RV spots down by the lake. You turn off the highway onto the property where the check-in building is. To the right of the highway is the forest for miles, and it is forest everywhere else around that area too. The highway is really the only thing that stands out, because it cuts right through the woods. Around the lake, there are some houses and other places, but generally, if it's not a long weekend, there are not many people out there. The cabins and RV area are separate, and the main building is about a 5 to 8 minute walk from the cabins up a spiral road. A little past the main building, there is a clearing with a couple of cabins that look like they have not been used in years, because grass and vines have grown around and over them. About 50 feet into the woods past those tables are 2 small lagoons surrounded by an old wire fence. Those 2 spots, the tables and the lagoons, become important later. We got there in the evening, unloaded the car, got settled into the cabin and explored a bit. Not much happened on the first day, since we did not go out much before it got dark. The next day though, it was cloudy and rainy, which we were actually hoping for because it meant fewer people at the resort and more freedom to explore. We wandered down by the lake and around the cabin area and eventually made our way up to the clearing with the tables. The tables had not been touched in what looked like a very long time, judging by how much grass and weeds had grown up around them. While we were looking around, I noticed that about 50 feet back in the woods, there seemed to be a clear area. We slid down into what was basically a ditch, probably about an 8-foot drop from the table area, and pushed through the brush. Eventually, we came to what we are pretty sure were lagoons, based on the way they were constructed. There was a wire fence around them. We walked around for a bit, planning to leave, when we saw what looked like a place where a large animal had gone over the fence and crushed part of it. At the time, we didn't really think much of it. We figured it had probably been bent like that for years. We poked around the lagoons a little bit more and then left, planning to come back the next day with big rocks to throw in the water since it was getting close to dinner time. The next day, we came back to the tables, planning to go into the lagoon area again. Before we had even climbed down the ditch, we stopped because we heard a noise. It sounded like something walking and snapping small twigs in the lagoon area we had been in the day before. The weird part was there had not been any footsteps before. We stayed there for about 10 minutes and then got hit with an intense feeling of dread. After that, we said screw it and went back to the cabin, where we played poker for the rest of the night. We talked about what had happened and laughed it off, saying it was probably just a bear or maybe rabbits. The next day it was raining heavily and was much darker than before. We left the cabin and planned to go back to the lagoon area later. But first, we wanted to hang out in a more forested area near the cabins that I had not mentioned earlier. As I said, after we had originally gone to the lagoon area, things started getting weird. We were messing around in the woods and breaking big sticks against trees when we heard what sounded like someone else doing the exact same thing about 200 feet away in the direction we were facing. It was hard to judge exactly how far away it was because of the way the forest carries sound, but it was definitely off in front of us. We would not have thought too much of it, except that the entire area beyond us was forest, and having someone out there that far in bad weather, with very few people at the resort, seemed unlikely. We decided to leave and come back later that evening. Spoiler alert, that was not a great idea. After leaving that area, we went back to the lagoon area and listened for a couple of minutes. We couldn't hear any walking, so we assumed we had been right, and that it was some kind of forest animal. But not even 10 steps in, I told my friend to stop moving. We both stopped and listened. We heard the steps again, but this time they were getting louder and faster, and that same overwhelming feeling of dread came back. We got out of there as fast as we could and ran back to the cabin. Later that evening, we returned to the forest clearing where we had heard the branch against the tree noise earlier in the day. We started smacking branches against trees again, but this time did not hear anything back. Then when I turned to my left, something caught my eye. There was what appeared to be a person standing behind a tree. I saw them duck behind it when they realized I had seen them, and I nearly lost it, and yelled to my friend that we needed to get out of there, so we sprinted back to the cabin. We went back the next day and I took a picture of where the figure had been standing. Later that night, while we were sitting in the loft area where our beds were, we talked about what had happened. There was a lot less joking this time, because we tried making sense of it, starting with the branch hitting tree noise. At first, we tried to explain it away as an echo, but that did not really fit, especially not the 5 seconds after hitting the tree. Only I saw the hooded figure in the same area later, but I knew it was a person, or at least I thought I saw a person. We were not sure what to make of any of it, so we moved on to talking about the lagoon and table area. But nothing especially useful was concluded from that conversation. We left the next day when our booking ended, but that was not the end of it. We came back last year around the same time, at the end of June, beginning of July, and brought another friend with us. We showed him around and told him what had happened the year before, and he took it with a grain of salt, as any sane person would. That changed over the next 3 days. This time the activity was not as much in the side forest, where I had seen the hooked figure, and where my friend and I heard the tree noise, although we did hear the returning knocks again. Most of it happened around the lagoon and table area. We decided to go into it after not hearing anything. Everything went fine. We returned the next day, and this time the footsteps were there again, but they were a little closer than before. We left the area, came back about an hour later, and we were determined to see what was pushing us out of that place, but we had to be quiet to get in. Slowly, we climbed down the ditch and made our way to the lagoons without anything noticing us, and we did not see anything there. Then we heard something snap a little further away, so we got out of there without making much noise. On the last day before we had to leave, we returned to the table and lagoon area again. We were planning to go down to the lagoons once more, but when we got to the table area we heard something new. It was a screeching noise, but it almost sounded human. At first we thought it might be a person who had hurt themselves and was calling for help. I stopped everyone and told them to listen before doing anything. What I heard sounded like a mix between a person yelling, an angry cat hissing, and a short dog bark. My 2 friends wanted to get closer and investigate, but I was against it. Still, we went anyway, although I stayed much further back because my gut was telling me to leave. We threw rocks near the area where the sound was coming from, hoping to flush it out, but nothing happened. Then we got too close. We were right on the edge of a ditch near the tables, and when I got close, as my friend did, something happened. The thing making the sound either threw a large log or knocked down a tree. Judging by the noise, I did not stay around long enough to find out which. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I was probably 15 feet ahead of my friends because my danger reflexes kicked in faster and told me to get the hell out of there. We got about 100 feet away before stopping. Nothing came after us, but the sounds started up again. We walked around the main building, and when we came around it, there was a black bear standing there. At first, we all let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe we had just been spooked by a bear. But then the bear did the same thing we had done, and got out of there as fast as it could. We did not investigate further and ran back to the cabin. Nothing else happened before we left the next day when our reservation ended. I do not know what the lagoon and table creature was, but I know for damn sure it was not a bear. The other thing in the forest I'm not sure about. I think they are separate things, because the woodsman or tree knocker as we've named it seems more elusive and like it's trying to lure us in, while the screecher more territorial and aggressive. I have tried looking online for similar experiences in the area, but have come up empty. Which is another reason I'm sharing this. Does anyone have any ideas about what these things are or could be? I have no clue what's going on there, but despite the strange things, the place is very beautiful. The cabins are very nice, even with spring beds, and the restaurant food is pretty good too. The place is called Purdon Lake Resort, if you look it up on Google. It's the one with the green roof. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I would like to give a huge thank you to J Nightmares for joining me in tonight's video, and if you enjoyed his work, you can let him know down below and follow the link that will be on screen shortly or at the top of the description to go over to his channel to show him some love as well. I would like to extend an extra special thank you to my absolutely phenomenal members and patrons whose names you can see on screen, and if you would like to join their ranks to get a bunch of cool perks, you can follow the links to find out more. I believe tomorrow for the members and patrons we have some exclusive haunted house stories, so that should be pretty fun to listen to if that is you. I'll be back on Thursday with some cult stories, so until next time, stay safe and good night.